Well, welcome to the Structural Modeling Video Conference for March 21st, 2020. Kevin Dye is going to lead a discussion on group inquiry methods. So, Kevin, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to switch the screen share over.
You just switched it off.
I just stopped screen sharing so that he could do it.
I got it. Okay.
Okay, so you should see a report
Yep.
title page called the Deliberation on Healthcare Access. You see that, Joe?
We got it. We have it.
Okay. So the topic we're going to talk about today were the development of a triggering question, and we're going to move towards doing a couple projects. One was the relationship of system science and systems engineering, which Janet Singer and liaisons between INCOSE and ISSS have been cultivating, and then also Peter's project on coordinating the world of marine biologists. And so first we're going to do a little look at a couple case studies, so just so we're in the same ballpark as to understanding what goes into the design of a structured dialogue application. So first, starting with the end, this is a summary report of a project, and then I'll show you a glimpse on the evolution of the triggering question for it. This was a project on healthcare access done for the South Coast of Massachusetts. The South Coast is the poorest section of Massachusetts, and they have a lot of problems, like heroin is rampant in New Bedford, and alcoholism very high, cigarette deaths are very high, and it's very, because it's poor, people don't have access even to afford to get to the hospital, and there's few community care operations at the time, and so forth. So we brought together through the Community Foundation a bunch of people concerned with this, and the title pages on these projects often look like this, where there's a name of the project. Often the name of the project doesn't come up until the project is done, which is interesting, because we start with a working title, and as we go through the inquiry, people's notion of what we're talking about evolves, and they come to settle on a title by which they want to present themselves to the rest of the world. And then there's always a bunch of partners that are the sponsors, and the sponsors are a specific role designated in Warfield's methodology, and it used to primarily mean who's paying for it. But over the years, over the decades, these roles that he's originally presented as very distinct and separate, they get complicated in specific projects. Another way to tell who is a sponsor is who can turn the project off, even if they're not giving money. Who can stop a project? So it might be someone with a lot of expertise in the area that everyone's respected and is not even involved in conducting your inquiry. If he says, don't trust those guys, he could shut it down, and he's actually sponsor. The hopefully you don't run into that. And then the report titles here, and and you see we're listing other large institutional sponsors and where it goes. SoCo Design was the name of the facilitation team, which was Tom Flanagan, myself, Craig Lindell, and a few other people. Excuse me a second. I'm just checking that my colleague Tom Flanagan can get in here. Okay. So these were the fellow on the left was someone from the private sector. He was a CEO of an environmental company. The guy in the middle was head of the community foundation, United Way type of guy. And the guy on the right was the director of the Economic Development Council of New Bedford and had run for mayor there. So he's very politically connected. So we had the political and the private sector and the philanthropists on the board of the facilitation team, and they hosted this. And in some years previous, we had run a project called the Future of the Creative Economy in New Bedford. We had 48 organizations, and these guys were at the center of trying to organize that. And after we did that structured dialogue project, we created this design group to do other projects like the healthcare. And that is that story is the model of how most structured dialogue projects have been done. They're referrals or spin-offs of previous projects. Almost none of them have been done by advertising or marketing the facilitation team or the method. It's usually started by someone that was in one of these projects. Then 3 to 5 years later, they find themselves in a new organization or a new big problem, and they say, we really need to do this type of project. Excuse me. So they bring, those people may become the broker for the next project, and they've been indoctrinated in the methodology. This particular project was centered around an adult leadership development program that was kind of run by the Chamber of Commerce, something like that. It was called the Leadership South Coast, though. And the guy that was in charge of it, you see all the way on the left here, the bald-headed older fellow, he had been the CEO of one of the larger hospital systems on the South Coast. So this particular project was in his wheelhouse. So I'm just going to now just cruise through this and give you just some imagery so you have a grounding on what we do before developing a triggering question. So there was a summary of the project, and this is a very stylized what we call a white paper. We give them an agenda for how this is going to work, and we give them a picture from a previous project to give them some expectation of what to expect the room's going to be looking like mid workshop. This project that's in the picture here is actually from a project on the future of energy efficiency for the Pacific Northwest, and the walls we have in the red are challenges, in different categories or clusters. In the right are solutions in clusters as well. And everything is color coded in this particular format of structured dialogue. We're doing problems and solutions, or challenges and directives. And problems are red, the solutions are blue, actions are green. And so we encode not just what they see on the wall, but what the colors of the paper that goes into their books, the colors of the text that are in the reports. Everything is coded to help keep people oriented towards what they're looking at. And you see these projects can get quite large. This particular project had, the one you're looking at the picture of, had 72 people in, and the wall display on top of the statements you see on the right was, I don't know, 15 feet tall. So you're surrounded by information. It's like a war room. Then we have a summary of who's coming to the table. That comes out of a stakeholder analysis, and there's a bunch of techniques for stakeholder analysis. The word stakeholder was an evolution of stockholder. It started in the 70s, and the idea was it's not just the people that own the capital, but everyone that's affected by the company, the customers, the employees, and people that are affected by the environmental repercussions of the company. In this case, we had a model of the stakeholders. That's kind of rare that we have a model of the relationship of stakeholders. However, in later years, past 10 years or so, we've started to do social network diagrams of the relationship of the stakeholders. And with respect to doing the triggering question, which is today's topic, the importance of the stakeholders is the different perspectives they bring to the table. And so, excuse me. So when we're doing one of these projects, there's typically a huge literature review, and we combine that with interviews of a sample of the stakeholders. And there's a couple guidelines on doing that. First, how big is the budget? Because doing interviews is extremely expensive. You need a couple people to be involved in it. The representative stakeholder, the person doing the interviewing, and the person that's helping handle the recording and the transcription. And then when you're done, if you're not doing it with a court reporter, you've got to either transcribe it or pay to transcribe it, or just take samples and transcribe it. And that's very costly. So typically a dozen people are interviewed, maybe 20. There's some research on this in Japan, unrelated to SDD, that how many people do you have to interview to get 100% of the product requirements for a new product? And what they found was if you talk to 10 people, you'll get about 70% of the requirements. If you talk to 20 people, you'll get about 85% of the requirements. There's actually some mathematics about this, unrelated to that research, based on Zipf's law, and a guy named Dunn. And based on the content that is generated and the number of distinct ideas, as you interview more and more people, fewer and fewer distinct ideas are contributed, and you can fit that to a curve and project for the specific situation how many people you have to interview to get to that 70% point or 85% point. Typically, these projects are underfunded, and we try to get to a 70% or under point, maybe 55 to 70% if we're lucky. So we have some samples from the literature of what's known about healthcare access. And we reference some other related work in the area. So these are samples of material from the literature. Then we got this more specific statements of directives from the state of Massachusetts. This is a quote from the governor about the situation, about we have a lot of people insured, but we don't have a lot of people that actually have access to care. As an example, another example in a different project for the World Health Organization, we were working on a disease that 1.1 billion people were at risk, and the statement to the audience was done by video feed from Mo Brundtland, who was the head of the World Health Organization. So we try to get the highest authority, highest recognizable authority in the room. Back in the 70s and 80s, when they started creating this methodology, they would just go to the head of the company, because most of the projects were done within an organization, or they'd go to the highest executive in an agency, a government agency, and then they would do the blessing ceremony. Since the 90s, when we've done more and more inter-organizational things, we don't have such a person. And so we have to kind of cobble together the role of the figurehead, the sponsor, from a combination of people. Unless you can find someone who's very charismatic to be the leader. And that person or their designee is usually the person that delivers the triggering question to the people in the room that are going to deliberate about it. So they act to commission the group. In speech act theory, the question is actually considered a directive, because you're posing the question, you're implicitly demanding the people to respond. And that is an interesting distinction of this group inquiry method from many others. There's a lot of techniques out there in dialogue, and they have a rule, which is we want to be respectful of people that just want to be silent and listen. And we don't allow that rule. And actually, it's based on a principle of from Habermas, which is that if you have a piece of the solution, you're obligated morally to share it. We don't care if it's uncomfortable or you want to sit back. That's actually a rule that comes out of mediation, not problem-solving dialogue. So now we have some more specific. We have data that's been collected about the specific situation. Often when we do an SDD, you'll come into the room and there'll be a whole wall of different data about the situation, like a war room. And the classic image there is Churchill's war rooms in London, in his bunker where he ran the war. You know, you had the map room, he had another room that tracked all the resources, he had another room that had banks of phones and so forth. And I mean, it used to be the white papers were mostly text. We've pushed more for this particular project. It's probably the most advanced we've ever done in terms of exploiting graphics, because people just don't read as much as they used to. So then we give a summary of sampling from the literature and from interviews with people. So this is another example of structured dialogue project that was done locally. This had 40 participants on the future of the creative economy, and many of these people are known to the ones in this project on healthcare. And so this kind of a stamp, imprimatur, I think you would call it, that stamp of legitimacy of why the time they're going to be spending in this will be valuable. So I had the list of all the organizations involved here on the left. How long did it take? What did it look like? There's one of the figureheads of the project. We produced a roadmap of the challenges and some directives to solve it. We also show some group learning. If you see this graph on the right, in the red is this is a graph of the number of votes an idea got versus the ideas across the bottom, and they're sorted in terms of the influence of the idea that was found after structured modeling. And so you see there does not seem to be any relationship between what people voted on as important and what in the blue is the actual influence of an idea. It was observations of diagrams that I created like this back in the 90s that led to the what we call the erroneous priorities phenomena, that what people think about what's important is uncorrelated with what they find to be influential after structured modeling. I also even extended that to word counts, the amount of time people spend in dialogue about an idea, totally uncorrelated, both with what they think is important and what's influential. So just an indication, people don't even know what to spend their time talking about, never mind what to vote on. And here you see the structure on the wall, and that's what's going to happen. So you're saying this is what we're going to go through. Here's a 2-page summary of what we're going to go through for today's, it's a day and a half project. We like to have the projects be a minimum of a day and a half. The original Warfield-Christakis method was 2 weeks. We spent a week on the problem side, a week on the solution side, and people don't want to spend time like that anymore. But we try to insist that they have a night to sleep after developing a structured understanding of the problem space, or at least being exposed to the total variety. So we at least like to finish clustering 50 to 300 ideas about the problems before they sleep. Preferably we get to structure it, but we want them to feel overwhelmed by the end of the day. And it kicks off a higher level reasoning process in the brain that tries to make sense of it. And so the rest of this is just the formal aspects of the design. We start with stakeholder issues and themes from the interview up here at the top in the gray. Then within the first day and a half of a workshop, we go over, we develop a system of challenges in the pink and red. If we have time to do that before the event, we'll do a preliminary one there in the pink. Then we follow with developing actions, and then an action plan where people commit to actions. And then if 3 different organizations commit to the same action, that forms a action team, collaborative action team, and so forth. Now, this is just one model where we do problems and then solutions. There's 7 classic archetypes of doing this. Problems and then solutions is only one archetype. And then in the Warfield-Christakis oeuvre, there's many different designs, but they didn't really explore all the ones they outlined were possible. And this is a project timeline, a Gantt chart, showing you how the structure gets built up over time and what the different activities were. So we start with the stakeholder identification, the literature, content analysis. We do stakeholder interviews. We draft the white paper. And sometimes by that point, after having gathered all that, we then put together the triggering question and deliver it right in the white paper. There's some school of thought that feels that the triggering question should be a surprise the morning of the beginning of the event. That was Christakis's position, because he didn't want people to pre-think it before they heard, saw who was in the room and things like that. We designed the details of the conversation down to the minute. Even though people are allowed to contribute as many ideas as they have, we were still able to control the agenda schedule within about 10% fluctuation. And that's an amazing thing about the process to me. It's kind of a law of large numbers that, you have some people that only contribute several things. Other people want to contribute 14 things. Somehow we still stay on the schedule because the way the method is designed. But it's also related to this phenomena that as people add more and more ideas, there's fewer and fewer unique ideas that come out. And if you have an estimate of how diverse that set of ideas is going to be from the interviews and the literature review, you can very tightly control the agenda to reach conclusion when you say you're going to do it on time. So these are other things about the methodology that I won't go through. These are the steps. First is that they've been exposed to the complex situation through a summary of the literature and the diversity of viewpoints. Often when I do these, I like to look for contradictions in the literature and the interviewees, and without attribution, present them as what I call a budget of paradox. That's a phrase taken from a book by the logician De Morgan, a budget of paradox. So, a list of 6 clearly conflicting opinions on the situation. And then people are presented the triggering question, they generate the ideas, they clarify what they mean, we inductively cluster them, people begin to do a shared language. We like them to be able to socialize as early as this point through a dinner. We want them to be able to sleep on it, let their subconscious start processing the complexity. That may happen by voting. Voting is sometimes the first time of the day they're able to get up and just walk around and mingle outside the coffee breaks. And then we do the structuring. We tell them what they thought was important isn't influential according to their own evaluation. And then we repeat this for the solution stage or whatever other techniques are going to be done. This is a close-up of, you see the red in the structure. The structure's read left to right. The most influential is on the left, least influential on the right. Right, so the things on the right in a medical model, the things on the right would typically be symptoms, and the things at the left are the causes. So that you see this cluster here in the middle at the end of the blunt end of the red arrow, that's what got the most votes as being important. But over here on the left at the blunt end of the blue arrow, that's what was found to be influential. And if you look on the graph here, the thing that was most influential is one of the 3 lowest voted in terms of importance. That's the erroneous priorities effect of the methodology. So I'm going to go from here to Joe. Do you know how to switch the shared window you have to go back into it?
Yeah, you need to go and back to the shared screen and either, select an application window.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to go to the entire screen because I'm going to be switching windows within a Word document. Okay, so for that project, does anyone have any questions? I'm now going to briefly go through how the triggering question for the healthcare project evolved.
That was really a good overview, Kevin. I think what you're going to do, so to relate what you're going to present now to what you've just presented, what you're going to do now is to specifically talk about who in that group of people designed the triggering question and when it was presented to the group.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Right. So, the two primary things that typically precede what I'm showing you now. Can you read the triggering questions, or should I make them bigger?
I'd make them bigger, please.
Okay. Okay.
All right, that's good.
Okay, so the stakeholder identification and analysis and the literature review. So I won't go into that right now. There's a lot of techniques for stakeholder identification and analysis, and social network analysis is now coming in to that in the last 10 years, at least the way I was practicing it. And so we then by the point that we've done the interviews with a selection of the stakeholders and we've done the literature review, the broker of the project, who is a role Warfield identified, stands between the stakeholder representatives and the facilitation team, and typically is a highly networked type of person. I forget the name that they have. He's a connector, or she's a connector. And we begin to develop the triggering question through a dialogue with them. And in some projects, we've actually traced the evolution of the triggering question. Sometimes that's happened in the matter of hours. I've been involved with a project that it went on for a year, and we tracked the email. So this one, we started with which problems to access, meaning healthcare access on the South Coast, if we solve them, would serve as a national model. So this, in Speech Act theory, this actually moves from, is trying to move the group from a directive, what should we do type of thing, which problem should we solve, towards what's called a declarative. A declarative is like John F. Kennedy saying, we will land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. That's a declarative. And this insert of would serve as a national model is a way of pulling the participants into making a declarative as a group, because we often don't have single individuals that can make declaratives everyone trusts. Now we're doing things like, we need to solve the climate change model, and 1,500 scientists sign on, and that becomes the basis of legitimacy for making a declaration across all the countries. So this evolved to what systemic problems in access to healthcare in the South Coast, if we solve them, would enable us to serve as a national model for health access assurance in the context of regional transitions catalyzed through changes in coverage via health reform. Right, so this is just way too long, but it's more specific. It's adding in context, so access to healthcare specifically where we live. And then if we solve them, it would be a model for health access assurance. Health access assurance was language that was being invented in this project by several of the leaders in the healthcare sector, a CEO, former CEO of a hospital, the head of public health in a neighboring town, a few other people. They wanted to use the term health access assurance instead of health insurance. And so this is something that happens in triggering questions. New language gets generated, or we want a new metaphor, right? So health access assurance is a new metaphor. It's been inserted in here a bit awkwardly because so much specifics going on in the detailing the question. So it went from that to something that was not much better. Then what are the key components of a system of health access assurance which the South Coast, owing to its particular set of problems in access, regional assets, and post-reform experience, can serve as a national model? Next one was, suppose that we in the South Coast can develop an approach to health access assurance in the next 5 years, what would it look like? So this is more of a visioning thing and actually would switch to a different SDD archetype, which is a future visioning project rather than a problem solution thing. It's depicting the attributes of an idealized situation. Here is an attempt at another metaphor, the bellwether idea. It's a national bellwether for addressing access beyond coverage. Access beyond coverage was a kind of a buzz phrase that was starting around the cognoscenti in the healthcare field at the time. What are the key components to this new metaphor, the health access assurance, which we could put in place within the next several years? I think this is within the next 5 years, which would turn around trends in lack of access by 2015. Now, this is the most specific, putting constraints on the timeline of the question. And usually all the triggering questions have a temporal component that's stated in the end. They're usually like 5-year plans or 10-year outlooks, things like that. I don't think I've ever been involved with a project where the outlook was less than 5 years. Anyway, so another round developed, another facilitator began generating these. This is a more futuristic one. It is the year 2025, and universal coverage has been matched by universal access. What were the key steps that we started taking in 2010 that got us to this point? So this is a 15-year plan, right? And this form of the question where you stand in your future and you look back to how you got there, that was a technique of futures introduced by Russell Aikoff from University of Pennsylvania and his Triple S department. I forget. It was like Social Systems Science Department, something like that. That's where Hassan Ozbakan was as well, a partner with Warfield and Christakis. And these 3 questions follow the Aikoff model, standing in your future, looking back to how you got there, he felt it was a much more powerful way to get you into futures thinking. And then there's some other variations on that model. I'm not sure if this was the last one that was done because this project was like 13 years ago. But what was accomplished in 2010 to 2015 that led to the recognition of the leadership framework for health access assurance as a model for other regions. So what we ended up with was a combination of the futures orientation, right? What was accomplished in 2010 to 2015. This project, I think, was done in 2007. So it's standing in the future, asking what happened before that future. And it's built on this metaphor of the health access assurance to something they called the leadership framework for health access assurance, which was through the dialogue, they realized that's kind of what they wanted to do. They wanted to make a statement that would become a lead for other regions. And the reason that we could do that is because the South Coast was a model for the rest of the country in terms of how poor they were in their demographics and the lack of access to healthcare facilities. So that gives you a quick view of that. So, any questions about that?
No questions yet. This is really interesting, and I'm sure we'll have a rich discussion, but proceed.
Okay. Just to break you out of the healthcare project, I'll quickly show you the beginnings of the evolution of a triggering question for an Air Force project. This project was on autonomous systems, informally known as drones. And the question was, this was a 25-year project, kind of a forecast of autonomous systems. We started with, what ought we do to govern a transformation in how we address autonomy in order to achieve the mid/far term science and technology vision. The S&T vision is something written by a directorate within the Air Force based on lots of different inputs, and we're responding to the mid to far term. Mid to far term is up to 25 years or so. The word ought is strategically chosen. It's based on a paper by Hassan Ozbakan. I think it was called Ought Implies Can, or Can Implies Ought. I can't quite remember, but ought is a moral and ethical statement. If you say, what should we do? That could just be, it could be a statement of precedence. We have to solve this problem before we do something else. But when you use the word ought, it has a moral overtone to it. And that part of, one of the reasons we put that in there is it's in the next 25 years, we have the capability, it's hoped that we'll have the capability to shift some ethical decision-making into drone warfare. So a shot could be taken without a person pressing the button. This is super controversial, and we couldn't touch it. We couldn't, they wanted to be able to have some aspects of a discussion about it, but we could not be explicit about it. So the way we got, pushed them, say we're going to be kind of in an ethical mode of thinking, which engineers are not used to being in. And so that's why the word ought was there. I won't go into other things about that particular thing, but we had a list of about eight assumptions that needed to be built into the question. Focus on technological trajectories towards the far term in autonomy. And there's a bunch of reports about that going back 20 years. Mechanisms that they would use to concentrate resources for the critical breakthroughs because they're too spread out and siloed within the Air Force research. To be able to go outside the Air Force because they were pursuing their projects on the same technology without really collaborating between the Navy and the Army and so forth. The need to identify and involve collaborators that they're not currently engaged with, and so forth. So this is usually always the case. There's more things you want to build into the triggering question than you can fit in a reasonable sentence. And so, but that's where you start with. Here's a little description of why the word ought was used. And this is how detailed these discussions get. Why did we use the word govern? It actually refers to an aspect of risk governance and management that they were referring to within the Air Force at the time. So here's some quick evolution. What should we do to foster the midterm? Whoops. Not sure what happened. Sorry about that. There we go. What should we do to foster the midterm vision for autonomy? So that's a really simple statement. You see, we dropped the ought and should because we have to see how people respond to it. We don't just create these triggering questions. We come up with a triggering question. We ask the broker, what does he think? And he says, I don't like the word ought. Can we use should? Ought's too fraught with morality. And these guys are uncomfortable about that. So can we use should? So we then take should. And then we ask a sample of people that are going to be in the room, representative stakeholders. We ask them the question two different ways. What should we do? What ought we do? How do they respond? Do they have an emotional reaction to one versus the other? That type of thing. How should we govern the transition from our near-term approach to the S&T vision for autonomy, the science and technology vision? What ought we do to govern? We're using the word we because the people that work on autonomy don't work as a we. They work in compartmentalized silos. To use the word we is very controversial with the management in the Air Force because the opposite of we, which is the primary thing they use to govern, is stay in your lane. Get in your swim lane. We don't want too many touch points. So they have these phrases to keep you isolated. And so they use the word we is a breakthrough idea, right? Even though the private sector, does collaboration and sometimes it's done in the military. But in the case of the research labs, everything's extremely compartmentalized. To use something like the word we, you have to test that out. Can people actually answer it without getting into a discussion that we're trying to overthrow the management structure of the Air Force? Okay, so I think you can see that it went on and on. This went on for months. The document tracking the evolution of this triggering question, I think, was like 40 pages long. No one has money to do that type of track, and we did it because we thought it would be interesting. It was probably the most complicated development of a triggering question I ever worked on in 30 years, and so I thought it'd be good to put in the extra time to track how this whole thing evolved, but I never get paid for doing any of that. Anyway, here's it. We got into analyzing this, the different aspects of the triggering question. You know, did it clearly define a system boundary? What was the structural type? You know, was it a prerequisite structure? Was it a problematique? Was it an action plan? Are we asking what, or are we doing a diagnostic of why, or do we want to figure out how to change the situation? What was the form that we were looking for, and so forth. So there's all kinds, in addition to the set of constraints that we wanted built into the triggering question, there were evaluative concerns of the results of the triggering question. So I think I'll stop there, and we can talk about what we would do for the questions Janet and Peter have on the table.
That's really great, Kevin. Good material and background. We have about 9 minutes left. So I think given the amount of material and new ideas, probably if it's okay, think about continuing this at the next session.
Yeah, I mean, both Janet and Peter's projects are timely to get involved with. I don't know if there's been a lot written about the relationship of systems science and systems engineering, but it's been in discussions for quite a while. I know there was in the ISSS Washington conference, there was a diagram put forth. Was that by you, Janet?
Yes, it was. Yeah, and this is great. Can you share some of this with us? And what you've been showing here, or
the documents, you mean?
yeah, or you should write something that is it's very valuable. It's interesting that you say that it's the people who ask for this kind of thing or people who have experienced it before. It's interesting that it's difficult to market. It's difficult for people to see the value of it. But it obviously is a real wealth of insight. So I'll turn it over to anyone else who wants to speak here for the little bit we have left.
Yeah.
A question of the timing it takes, as you say, Kevin, and sort of the ordering of things and the way that different people come at creating the question, for example, and when you introduce the question to the group, and then how the group defines itself as a we or a not we. These design questions before you even begin seem to be quite crucial in the framing of the whole procedure or process, and that's what gives me pause, particularly when you talk about systems engineering and systems science. I mean, there's still a continuing effort here to rework the CBOC and what is the systems science foundation for systems engineering, and so on and so on. And anyway, so it provokes a lot of questions, and I've just jumbled them all up. But I guess, procedurally, the step-by-step that you identified, and how the question is constructed, oughts versus shoulds, we's versus me or I, and then how you in a sense encourage people to take the time to do this, because there is such a time investment. I guess those are my comments and questions. Thanks very much.
Yeah, there's Warfield and Christakis didn't really write anything about doing triggering questions or how to come up with them. It's a process since the 70s that's been learned by apprenticeship. And I apprenticed on a lot of them since the 92 or so. And I don't know, some time ago, I started collecting notes and also looking into literature about development of questions. There is a literature about questioning and how to create a question within philosophy. It's called the field of aerotetics. And there's a lot about how to refine a question that comes out of survey research. Really amazing techniques for refining, but not so much for coming up with the original question from that branch of research. So because it was an apprenticeship model, I started pushing our community to document their case studies, right? So you could transfer the expertise, or at least support the apprentice, transfer it out of the primarily apprenticeship mode, or at least support the apprenticeship mode with actual cases. But unfortunately, when people do case studies within the structured dialogue community, what they mean by a case study is they take the report that is the results of the dialogue and then try to publish it. And there's fewer and fewer journals willing to take those publications anymore unless they are in the topic of the dialogue. Like if it's about healthcare, it'll be in a healthcare policy journal. Or if it's about the Air Force, it won't be published because it's secret. But people do not or have not tracked what they went through to prepare for the dialogue. That's the case study from the facilitator standpoint. And there's almost no literature about that.
Yeah, but that's the crucial part, isn't it? I mean, because you set it up, and the way you set it up, I mean, sensitivity to initial conditions, the way that you frame it could, or most likely will, influence the outcome.
Right.
And I think that's a crucial piece of it. And the identity issue about who the we are, as it were, and getting that sense is another crucial piece if you're going to move forward. I think this needs to be written up, Kevin, if you haven't. That would be a very useful contribution.
Yeah. I mean, the most basic summary of how you do this is you get a bunch of input from people and papers. You start coming up with the questions with someone that's well networked within the field. And you go back and forth in dialogue and come up with what you think is a good few questions. And then you test that with a dozen people that are stakeholders.
Yeah, I've sort of done that.
And you just keep iterating. That's the most basic guideline.
All right. Well, we have about 2 minutes left here. Is there any other questions people would like to ask or put on hold to think about for the April 4th meeting?
Should we start to do this with the, with Janet's and Peter's projects?
Well, I think Janet and Peter would need to answer that.
Well, certainly. I mean, I'm, more than happy to explore what we could do. Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe we'll put that on as a topic for the April 4th.
I guess, Kevin, the question is, what do you need from us? And maybe we would choose one or the other. Peter has been involved in Gary's project to some extent too. So we need to hear from you what you need before we even get on the table, get these issues on the table, but maybe that can also be discussed on the 4th.
Yeah. Okay. I'll send an outline out in the email. We can just start by seeing if we can get access to a sample of people from both projects, and if there's any literature on the topics, that would be a way to start.
All right, then. Well, this has been very interesting, informative, and productive. And I look forward to continuing it on April 4th. Are there any final comments?
Just wanted to say hi. I'm glad I dropped in the middle of the session. It was very nice to be here.
All right. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more? All right. Well, then we'll go ahead and I'll end this broadcast, and we'll be ready for April 4th, where we'll continue the discussion. Thank
Okay.
you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Kevin.